Shall we begin? Yeah. All right. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the war against Chinese restaurants. And like most histories, it's a male-dominated history. This image that you're looking at is a work that I made called Extraction. And it's in recognition of my mother, who is the person most responsible for cultivating my interest in art and material culture. It's one of a series of works where I substitute objects and graphic images for numbers within certain mathematical operations. So the iniquitous chop suey joint, iniquitous is defined as bad, dark, evil, immoral, nefarious, rotten, sinful, unethical, unlawful, unrighteous, unsavory, vicious, vile, villainous, wicked, and wrong. I'm going to start by talking about my personal experiences growing up in a Chinese restaurant. I'll be showing you images and artwork and documents, immigration documents, related to individuals that work directly in the chop suey trade. And then later, public perceptions of the chop suey restaurants, and particularly the various kinds of assaults made upon them. This is an image called Flower Water. It's basically a history of labor in my family, and they're encased or enveloped by a 19th century woman's hoop skirt. So it's a gendered image, and of course, obviously, the most public aspect of the whole deal is that teapot on the right side. Inside, outside. I'm going to kind of talk fast, and I'm afraid there's no time for questions until the end, but I'd rather cover all of this material so that you have a number of topics to think about than to dwell. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to go through as fast as I can. My great-grandfather was a gold miner in Oroville and Marysville, California. The dates are 1858 to 1866. Which is a period of time longer than a usual coolie contract. He was a laborer, a contracted laborer, a coolie, but he had to stay longer because of an accident. His queue, his pigtail, was severed. He was an expert underwater fisherman. He could hold his breath for 10 minutes, my family said, and he would get the greatest bounty of fish. But one day he didn't come up. So his friends went in after him in the river, and they found him drowning. And with a knife, they severed his queue and released him, saving his life. This print's narrative is also conflated with the story, documented story, of two drunken white miners who wagered whether a Chinaman could swim. They tied rocks to his ankles, threw him in the river, and watched him drown. And so this is called Kuo Chung. My great-grandfather's name is Kuo Chung. Kuo Chung's release. Uncle George on the left, the first of the four brothers to arrive in the United States, that was in 1911. It's diagrammed to connect to the birth record of Kuo Chung. He was born in 1844. This record was found under the pillow of my paternal grandfather's in the center deathbed, and brought to me by another uncle's aunt, because it was known that I was interested in family history. That was presented to me in the 70s. In the center is my grandfather, George's father. He was an opium addict. He worked very little in his life, and he stole from his children. And I think it's remarkable that I've had personal conversations with a man, Uncle George, who told me about experiences he had with a man who came to the United States during President Franklin Pierce's presidency, pre-Lincoln. I've talked to a guy who told me about a guy who lived here in 1858. And so I did this print called Grand Phantom, where I kind of visualize my relative proximity to the Civil War era and the age of emancipation. And this nebulous, can you see the cursor? Yeah, the nebulous, that's my grandfather. This is not a restaurateur. This is a laundryman, Lao Angbak. He visited the restaurant, and as a child, he really bothered me because he was the most retracted, vulnerable adult I had ever been in the presence of. You know, there's the word coeval of our time. I didn't know it then, but I think what bothered me was that he was not coeval. And I was concerned. It really, every time he came around, I had this weird feeling, and I wanted to shake him. And it was like, wake up. And the waking, it's called Take Waking, deliberately in Pidgin English, but the subtitle, or the subtitle in the making of this was The Laundryman's Dream. These are etchings, by the way. They're photo etchings. They combine hand drawing with digital photography. This is a print called Evergreen. The working title for this is There Is No Contradiction, because my uncle, Chen Yuk-thu, the hatchet man, I didn't know he was a hatchet man until he died. And then, you know, my father and his brothers were very silent men, as you can all imagine, in the Chinese community, and except when they get rip-roaring drunk. And the stories that came out, and the bloodshed that came out. I mean, stuff would happen when they got drunk. And I found out that he had been a hatchet man. And so when he gave me his hatchet, I didn't know what it meant. He handed me his hatchet, the one downstairs. I didn't know what it meant, but my mother took it away from me and hid it. And I didn't find it until decades later. Well, anyway, everything in this print he handed to me. He gave me things. He was very generous to me. He was the kindest, gentlest, sweetest man. He was my favorite uncle. And he was a killer. And I know that he killed a Moy, because if you capture somebody, nail them up alive in a crate, put them on a train and send them to San Francisco, there's no way you can survive that. It's just horrible. Ed, you were saying how horrible. I mean, really, my favorite uncle was engaged in some really kind of gruesome stuff, right? And yet he's my favorite uncle. This is why the working title for this print is There Is No Contradiction, as the Buddhists say. And some of the things he gave me are here. This is the section about, I call him Sambak, Chen Yuk-thu. He lived, his last residence is at Triple Crown's dining room. That was his living room. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's a building owned by Chen Jiaklem, the man who single-handedly started the Fourth Tong War in 1924. He willed it to his son Jack Chin, a man we called our cousin. Lenore knew him. So Jack Chin's father was Chen Jiaklem. He's in the history books. He single-handedly started the Fourth Tong War. Here he is. Here's my uncle, Sambak, I'll call him, on the right side. In 1925. It's documented as 1925. And here's his work history. This is to me, a really interesting document from his National Archives immigration file. And there he is, King Hong Lo, 1922-23, Canton Tea Garden, 23-25, Jade Cafe, 25 to 32, and so on and so on. Orange Garden is here. He's a man that I think ripped off the Canton Tea Garden with those silver soldered things. This is my father at the age of 16, scared shitless, landed in Seattle, put into detention. So they come off the boat, the men are separated from the women. They're marched up the hill to 84 Union Street on the lower right. They're stripped, they're bathed, they're put into uniforms, and they're kept from the general populace awaiting their interrogations. And so my father was a paper son, and if you don't know what that means, he came under an assumed identity. There was a person, purportedly his father, a paid person, to play the role of a merchant, because the Chinese exclusion laws allowed merchants and the minor sons and the children of merchants to legally enter if they could prove their identity as being true. So he has to memorize hundreds and hundreds of detailed facts. They're going to try to trip you up. The interrogators, the white interrogators, are working with collaborators from the villages, Chinese men. and they play games with you. On the lower left is the only known photograph. I found it in Luther Whedon's personal papers. There's his signature on my father's identity certificate. It's the only known photograph of the interior. That's how my father bunked on these folding grates for over a month. This Japanese baby, according to the citation, was separated from its parents and detained. Sound familiar? I made this print called Alien 503011-15. That's my father's number. And when I found out by reading his immigration file and the duress that he was under, it's just withering what they did to him. He's 16 years old. And I realized for the first time how hard it was for him. And my father and I never got along. Lenore will tell you he hated me. That's probably true. And yet, having discovered the National Archives files fairly recently, like 4 years ago, I decided to do another image of him where there was a little bit more empathy. He wanted to be a calligrapher. He was interested in the arts. And this has something to do with his aspirations and his limitations. And here he is on the top right. His paper father, Chan Woot, on the left. Remember that name. He comes up later in this presentation. Chan Woot, my paper grandfather. Now look on the right, if you can see it. Of what are the floors made in your house? Tile. That does not agree with what your father said. It is tile. Anything besides tile? No, nothing else. Does your mother wash those floors or sweep them, right? You can see where the interrogator is going. Like if they're tile, why would you wash them? And that's, so they got him. This is the kind of thing that gets you deported. This is a really dramatic moment in the 30-page interrogation. This is page 16. And I go on and on and on, and I found, they call Chan Woot in. They say, hey, you said your floors were made of dirt. Your son says the floors are made of tile. What's going on? Explain this discrepancy. So Chan Woot is this very deft guy. And he goes, my son has an acute sense of shame. He was embarrassed to say that our floors are made of dirt. They're made of tile. And that problem is dismissed. There were a couple of other little glitches where my father didn't get it right. There are these cheat notes. If they find cheat notes on you, you're deported, just like that. And it would be wonderful if this museum could get an original set of cheat notes. Yes, we have some. Oh, you have them. Oh, I'd love to see them. Oh, man, that's great. From Chicago, Chinese? Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. And, for people, historians of immigration, I think these documents are really important. I mean, people who study anti-Chinese immigration, they write on and on about the provisions of the 1917 Act and then the 1924 Act. What I've underlined is, upon failure to maintain the status under which admitted, he will depart from the United States. Meaning, okay, you can fool us now, but we find out about you later, you're out. So imagine the onus of burden. You come to this country, you pass your interrogation, and for the rest of your life, you've got to stringently maintain that identity. And then, when I read these documents, I realize what kind of pressures that were put upon these people, these aliens, and it kind of explains their behavior. I mean, these were really silent men, and you kind of understand why they were so fearful and vigilant, right? Yeah. These are from the National Archives in Seattle. And here he is on the left, the last photo of him taken leaving China. And 2 years later, the photo on the right, taken in uptown Chicago. By then, he's got a white girlfriend. I talk about this later. He goes dancing with her at the Aragon, and there's all kinds of trouble. But there he is. He didn't wear glasses. He's got the prop on, and this kind of photographic self-fashioning is just so effective, right? 2 years. Isn't that amazing? That's a whole thesis, right? About, photography and self-fashioning and identity and so, I thought that would be fun for you to see, I made these two prints to be separate from one another. The one on the left is called Core Locus, where the heart is. That's his steamer trunk and the steamer trunks of other Chinese aliens. And it's kind of a constraint release thing, conceptually. And then on the right, a hat pin peril, which was a real thing. Hat pins of a certain length were outlawed, I think over 9 inches, because women used them as weapons. And men were killed with hat pins, literally. You can find this in the press. So my father goes dancing with Blanche Kruger, and even more scandalously, his English teacher, married with a child. She's messing around with this 18-year-old. And they go dancing at the Aragon, and a garrulous, mean-spirited old aunt who loved to humiliate anyone she could and be disturbed and disturbing, told me, your father would go dancing with this white lady at the Aragon, and all the white women around him would take out their hat pins and stick them to humiliate him. Now, my father worked at the Jade Cafe. When he landed, he went straight to the Jade and lived there. So he's like 16, 17 years old, 1926. He ends up buying the Jade Cafe in 1956, 40 years later, sole proprietor. But in 1934, he's stationed in the area of the rare booths where John Dillinger would come with his lawyer, Louis Piquet. John Dillinger had just busted out of this Indiana prison. He killed a man, fled back to Chicago. J. Edgar Hoover issues the wanted poster. That scares him. He gets nervous, and he decides he's going to try this new technique called plastic surgery. He wants the jowls of his face filled out. He wants the cleft in his chin filled out, and he wants the mole between his eyes removed. And they do this in somebody's living room under kind of local anesthesia. And they implant kangaroo tendons into his face. And he comes to, and he's in excruciating pain. He reaches for his Tommy gun and threatens to kill everybody in the room. But he doesn't. And in this recuperation period, he eats at the Jade Cafe, where he's consulting with his attorney, Louis Piquet. And my father was stationed there. And so I grew up with these famous stories told repeatedly about how my father waited on John Dillinger. And you can imagine what was that like. My father waiting on this notorious gangster killer. But essentially, this print called My Father and Dillinger is an abstract portrait of my father. We were very distant from one another, and in the true definition of abstraction, which is a separation or a distancing from any instance or thing, this is an abstract portrait of my father through the subconsciousness of John Dillinger under general anesthesia. And you can read about John Dillinger the way you can read about the Beatles, the day in the life of the Beatles. Like everything known about them is online. Same thing with John Dillinger, because there's a big cult following about this guy. I know much more about John Dillinger than I know about my own father. And so one of the concepts in this print turns out to be like, what does it mean to know somebody? This is a print about my father and his favorite brother, Fong. They were as different from one another as you can imagine. My father's retracted and ungiving and retrenched and fearful. Fong is adventuresome, gregarious, sociable, generous. Fong wanted me to make him a papier-mâché pagoda to put on top of a 68 VW bus so that he could sell egg rolls at the Indiana State Beach. And I'm really sorry that I never made that pagoda for him, but here it is. It's kind of a restitution. You'll notice the sign, the chop suey sign, right? That's downstairs, right? So stemming from that kind of root object is these two men that are as different from one another as possible, and yet they're bonded, which is interesting to me. It's called presque-vous, which is a tip of the tongue syndrome. You can know exactly what you want to say and how to say it, but you don't say it, you can't say it. It's a syndrome. And I wondered sometimes if my family has presque-vous because they're so silent. But again, is it a silence out of, what is that? Is that about fear? Is it about, this fear of revealing, of being found out, right? What is that? I'm not sure. But when we went to China for the first time, I didn't want to go because I don't want to be in a country filled with people like my family. You know what I mean? Like reticent and ungiving and, and it's just ogreish, joyless, harsh. I didn't want to go. Of course, I went to China. It was entirely different. It's not Chinese. It's my family. So that was important to experience. And then we went back. And here the two brothers are. Third, my cursor should be apparent. Fong, my father. Fong is the one that introduced racial diversity into my family. Fong was the one who famously, as famous as my father was for serving John Dillinger, my Uncle Fong was famous for having black friends. And blacks and yellows don't mix very often. We'll be talking about this a little bit more. But Fong did. And when I was growing up, that racial diversity was really in my consciousness. And he marries a white woman. There she is, Lydia Pryfogel. This is a white lady living in our house. Just dissonance, it was interesting. But here's the Jade Cafe. Now I'm going to start to talk about the restaurants that the Chens kind of joined, created partnerships to buy. This is the first. This is on 4027 West Irving Park. And that restaurant now, Chakran, where the Jade was, is a pretty good Moroccan restaurant if you haven't been. And if you sit in the pillow room, that's where John Dillinger sat. Oh, wow. They don't know that. Wait a minute. Okay. Howard Wong is the original proprietor of the Jade Cafe. I found this out through the 1923 city directory. This building was constructed in 1921. I believe that the storefront was occupied first by the Jade Cafe in 1922. I think my family took possession of it in 23, 24. And here's the Orange Garden. Many of you have been there. But look, the original owner is Chan Woods. In other words, Chan Woot. It's a misspelling of his name. Chan Woot is the documented first owner of the Orange Garden. Now, my cousins, the daughters of George, will tell you that George started it. I'm here to tell you that's not true. And we can prove it. All right? I'm going to clarify that. Sambach, the hitman, the hatchet man, was a wealthy man through gambling. In World War II, he wagered $30,000 bets in the 40s. Big stakes gambler, high stakes gambler, right on the corner of that storefront, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know. But that's where he would gamble. And then, now look at the resemblance of the Orange Garden in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Fong's restaurant in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the Oriental Garden. Look at the similarity of these facades. The fluted aluminum, the enameled steel panel. And I believe that it was my family that made the decision to upgrade to deco. I think the Orange Garden sign dates to early 30s. Now, in that decade, in the 20s, you could go one way or the other. You could do this Qing Dynasty thing with the inlaid tables and the carved ornate grill work. This is King Fong Restaurant in Omaha. If you haven't been there, that's a shame because it's now closed. They're looking for national status, like landmark status. It's owned by the film director Alex Payne, who grew up in Omaha and loves this place and is buying it, hopefully, so that it can be preserved as you see it. But at about that same time, my family is creating restaurants of this style. And that's the interior of the Oriental Garden on Washington Street in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This is gorgeous. Now, here are the chairs that I was telling you about downstairs, the Jade Cafe chairs. Fong, when I was a child, he proudly told me in passing, I took the splats off of those and I designed a different back. You see them? Same chairs, different back splat, right? Yeah, and very effective. But here's like, at the Jade originally, 19th century vinaigrette cruettes were used as soy sauce bottles, but they were very awkward. You had this glass stopper and they dripped and everything. And then later on it got modernized to the tonic bottles, the Barber's tonic bottles. And then again, here's the original silver plate. And then that gets substituted for with Bakelite and stainless steel. You know, I was saying Fong is the guy that introduced racial diversity to me. For some reason, and it must be Fong. Fong is the one that takes my family to the Black and Tan clubs of Chicago. They go to the Club de Lisa, they go to the Cafe Ramboogie, all on the south side. The Cafe Ramboogie was owned by the boxing champion Joe Louis. And so that's where they hung out. And here he is with Aunt Lydia. Now listen, they were, okay, before I go into that. This, I'm so glad, Andrea, that you decided to show this letter downstairs. I only reproduced page 1 for this presentation. Page 2 is very important. Because on page 2, Fong is saying how hard it is for him to juggle his business interests with serving blacks, and downtown restaurants in Fort Wayne didn't serve blacks, but he did. And you can read in this letter that Cab Calloway is eating at his restaurant and a party of 2 tables gets up and walks out. They don't like that. They don't want to eat in the same dining room with Negroes. Furthermore, we can't stand to see white girls waiting on them. Now, this thing about white girls becomes a prominent theme in tonight's discussion. It's a really interesting letter. One of the orchestra members says, hey, I got kicked out of a restaurant in Fort Wayne. I went up to a cop and said, I served in the war. What about my rights? The cop goes, and walks away. That's in the letter. And then on page 2, Fong is saying, I'm having a real hard time juggling this. And he's writing to Wilkerson. He's writing to Robert Wilkerson, who's the Black Urban League president of Fort Wayne, Indiana. It is known that Fong is serving blacks, so Wilkerson wants to solicit comments from Fong about this business practice of his. I have a feeling he couldn't sustain that. He lost the Oriental Garden, and from there on, he was on a downslide. And he spent the rest of his life looking to regain his fortune, and he never found it. He died in total poverty. Now, why did I show that horrendous photo? Aunt Lydia Trifago grew up in Marion, Indiana. Marion, Indiana. And I'm about 9 years old, standing in my dining room. She's visiting from Fort Wayne. She's towering over me from behind. I'm looking at this photograph. I've blackened out the hanging victims, the lynched victims. She reaches over my shoulder. She points to this girl and says, I was there, that's me. I was speechless. It was just so horrific looking at this. And then my aunt says, that's me. And if I were alive now, I would just be asking so many questions, you know. This is the most famous, notorious, ugliest, I think, of the lynching photos that are published. This is Marion, Indiana in 1930. Thousands of spectators drove to this site to celebrate. And from the very earliest years of Chinese restaurants, it's noted that they're mixed. They're racially mixed. On one table sits a Negro woman with striped shawl and United States Marines and so on. On the right, from Des Moines, Iowa, black, white, and yellow were included in the crowd placed in the city jail. And it's like anomalous and it's curious, it's suspect, but ultimately the message is they're all iniquitous together. That's the message. This really jumped out at me from the Chicago Tribune. If you're interested in the relationship in these years between Black Americans and Chinese Americans, you've got to look at Arnold Shankman's treatise called Black on Yellow, published in the 70s. I think that's a good starting point, 1978. We'll talk more about this later. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. I didn't realize it until fairly recently how exceptional Fong was, and therefore my family. But yeah, things weren't good between blacks and Asians, historically. Not good, for lots of reasons, from both sides. I like the idea of unification and peaceable coexistence, and I'm really interested in black and yellow collaboration, and you find it in the Mississippi Delta in the late 19th century and early part of the last century, where former coolies are imported through the Transcontinental Railroad to the Delta to compete with the freed blacks, but in many cases they form partnerships and they intermarry, and so the Teasdale family, the Wong family, these are from all appearances black families today, but their ancestry is Chinese. I personally had a relationship with Philippe Wong, a black man who identified culturally as Chinese, was the president of the Los Angeles Chinese Association, and whose father was Philippe Wong, one of the first blacks to arrive in Louisiana in 1867 by way of Havana, Cuba. I personally knew this man. I made this print called Plain Weave. I took apart a Chinese erhu and an American banjo, and I reconstructed them and stitched them together with agricultural implements from sugarcane plantations, where they worked collaboratively and cooperatively on sugarcane plantations. I think the most famous black and yellow kind of intersection when it comes to Chinese restaurants is the bombing of the Golden Lily restaurant. What was that, on Garfield Boulevard? It was in 1929. Now, yellow lined, here's the gist. Told police he believed the bomb was the result of having supplanted a white orchestra with colored musicians a few weeks ago. So he fires the white orchestra and he hires Tiny Parnham and his orchestra, phenomenally successful RCA Victor recording star, whose work is very close to Jelly Roll. You know, it's in the vein of Jelly Roll Martin, if you kind of can hear that. This is Tiny Parnham. The place was bombed when the white orchestra was fired. 1929. Who were the early patrons of Chinese restaurants? In 1889, there was one Chinese restaurant recorded in the press. In 1893, after the Columbian Exposition, it was said that there were 3, and then like by 1905, there were like, it was exaggerated. They said there were 200. It can't be, but exponential explosion of the numbers of Chinese restaurants. They were people that lived at night. Actors, actresses, cabmen, policemen, court reporters. Yeggers were street people that sold stuff on the street, mostly clothing. Slummers, the Bohemians. Another early concern about Chinese food and Chinese restaurants is like what's in it. Lots of controversy about what's in it. Chinamen serve some queer combinations of little-known viands. And in this box in on the left, this 2 patrons at a Chinese restaurant in Chicago get into a fight about what's in the chop suey. One guy pulls out a knife and stabs the other one. One guy's white, one guy's black. So, you know, this is down on South Clark and Van Buren. were the first Chinatown. Courtesy of Lenore Metric, this is her trade card. This is from the 1880s. This is the visual This is the kind of visual culture that exists in the United States at the time of Chinese exclusion. And historians of trade cards, chromolithographic trade cards, have written that the ugliest, most scathing, most hateful imagery in that genre pertains to Chinese Americans. They're awful about blacks. They're just ugly about blacks. You know, the watermelon stuff and but man, I mean, this is what the Chinese are coming to. Okay, so what's in the food? On the left, it's alleged that it's garbage. In the middle, it's alleged that it's dog meat. And on the right, human flesh, particularly the flesh of white children. This is for real. Oh, doesn't Tom Hanks eat babies? Right? QAnon? We're still there, really. I mean, we can think, oh my God, how primitive or something, but plenty of people are still thinking like this. This one headline from the Des Moines Register 1909 says a lot. The word war is used. They're declaring a war on the restaurants. They have to go. And here it is, this thing about girls. It's the downfall of many young girls. This is a really good, succinct kind of poster for the war on Chinese restaurants. Chicago, both from the Tribune, 1910. Sin, vice, right? These girls are going to smoke cigarettes, they're going to drink, and they're destined to become slave wives of Chinamen. They're going to get dragged down to lives of open shame. On the right, the vanity and the desire for showy clothes led to their downfall. They smoked and drank in the chop suey restaurants and permitted themselves to be hypnotized by the dreamy, seductive music that is always on tap. So it's pure puritanical kind of thinking, right? This is Puritanism. And here's one of the fallen women in her fancy clothes, taken at Charlie's Chop Suey in Oroville, California, where my grandfather was a gold miner, Oroville. I date this to about late teens, 1920. Beers and noodles and Chinese joints have caused the downfall of countless American girls. And there's that thing again about why white slavery, and such resorts are fruitful fields for the white slave procurator. Unbelievable. This is for real. They want, if it's hyperbolic, they want this hyperbole to turn against the Chinese. That's the thing. And here's a kind of a short list of kind of the city ordinances and the state statutes meant to prevent Chinese women from entering Chinese restaurants or working in them. But look, I mean, if you scan the list from Pittsburgh to Iowa, they all fail. The bill is vetoed by the mayor, is directed against the Chinese race. The Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts objects and the bill is withdrawn. In Montana, William Jennings Bryant, the U.S. Secretary of State, catches wind of this legislation and says, and the House committee withdraws it. But it takes intervention from the U.S. Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryant. In Iowa, in Des Moines, a judge issues an order preventing women from being served, white women from being served in Chinese chop suey places, but he corrects himself. He has this pang of consciousness, saying it's not equitable to prevent women from partaking of Chinese meals. And that report is in this inset here. This is that article that Judge DeGraff is rescinding his improper judgment. And so it's interesting that the rule of law really is, to some extent, kind of like these safeguards. I didn't know that they were defeated on these levels. fairly regularly. And there were more moderate voices. This was a cartoon strip in the Des Moines Register. On the left, the sensationalized. On the right, the kind of the mundane, real world. On the left, here's this kind of multitasking Chinaman. He's dragging his white slave by the hair and hitting the pipe at the same time. And on the right, the more mundane bone of contention, which is, why don't you put more chicken in this chop suey? I thought this was really interesting, because it's not the typical sensationalism in visual culture that's applied against the Chinese. On the top left, the Opium Ranch of San Francisco, the Yellow Terror in the center, and the Mongolian octopus with his firm grip on immorality, among other things. This is typical. Now this document here pertains to Elsie Siegel. Elsie Siegel and her mother did missionary work amongst the Chinese. She was the granddaughter of the famous Civil War Union general Franz Siegel, an American hero. And she falls in love with two Chinese men. One of them is the manager of Port Charles restaurant in New York City. And this intense jealousy happens between William Leon and Chu Gain. And it's all messed up. I mean, you can see, if you read carefully, Elsie's writing letters to him, she's writing letters to the other. I don't love Leon, I just had to kind of like make him think I did, but I really love you. It's really messed up, really, really messed up. And he kills her. And he puts her in this trunk, and her body is found in his apartment on 8th Avenue. He's a restaurateur. He owns a restaurant on Amsterdam Avenue. Chu Gain is in Chinatown managing. This is a huge seismic event in the Chinese community. For years, because he escaped and he was never found. William Leon never was found. But for years, countless Chinese men were held as suspect, as accomplices, or as William Leon himself. It was just this terror in the Chinese community because of this event. Everyone was on eggshells in Chinatowns throughout the United States. But in the white community, there's all this kind of cogitation about what the fuck is going on. Why are these Chinese men hooking up with Chinese women? Why is this happening? This is really interesting. And there's all this kind of psychoanalytic stuff going on in the press. And so after Elsie Siegel, this missionary, is murdered, this is worth reading. The very fact that white men despise Chinese and often ill-treat them stirred what may be called a maternal instinct in the women who made themselves responsible for the welfare of their charges. Just as a mother loves most tenderly her most misshapen and ill-favored child, so these girls felt their hearts moved by the thought that their converts had all the world against them. Then again, the personality of the Orientals, with their insidious ways and fawning manners, made the appeal still stronger. Add to this the fact that religious emotion is very closely related to one that is physical, and we find a combination which explains why so many of these young women went astray and why in their converts they ultimately found lovers. They can't believe this. What is going on? And this is a trade card from Lenore's collection as well. This one is not scandalous. It's very insidiously subtle, which is why it's so effective. So this woman is casting a shadow. The shadow is of the woman, and that shadow is an implied threat to her continually. And it's just so interestingly complex. It's called a queer shadow. They're trying to figure this all out. There was one theory that in the Russo-Japan War, the little yellow men defeat the Russians. They take Port Arthur. They capture Port Arthur. This is why this restaurant is called Port Arthur, in celebration of the kind of Asian victory. Okay, so they defeat the Russians and now they feel superior. And now they're marrying white girls. The Chinaman might become a dangerous rival of the white man in love affairs. And the proof of that is like there's this downtown department store and 6 Chinamen have nabbed pretty young women to marry them. Chin Loy is a prominent early Chinese-American citizen in that section called at Clark and Van Buren. He lives at 329 South Clark. As far as I can determine, the earliest address, the first Chinese restaurant was in the basement at 329. Above it was a very prominent grocery store. Chin Loy was managing and very prosperous, and he marries a white woman. And here's a quote from the former commissioner of the New York Police and U.S. House of Representatives, a congressman. Lenore introduced me to a book called How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle by Frances Willard, a suffragette and social reformer in the late 19th century. She lives in Evanston, right on Chicago Avenue. Her house is still there. It's not a treatise on how to ride the bicycle. It's not a technical manual. It's a social treatise. It's about about the radical changes that women experienced when they had the freedom to get on a bike and go. They shed all of the accessories that encumbered them. They band together in women's bike clubs. They went to parts unknown together. Oh my God. The men didn't know where they were going. It was noted that when they rode, they elevated their posteriors and other provocative gestures. And every woman's bike had a little leather holster attached to the frame for a firearm. And Frances Willard said, it was said that was to ward off aggressive animals, but it wasn't. It was to ward off aggressive men. So what I'm talking about now is hard to talk about because this isn't anything that's published. It's just my own putting together of historical information. There was a syndrome, a very widespread syndrome in the late 19th and early 20th century called neurasthenia. And Teddy Roosevelt had it, William James had it, Henry James had it. It was exhaustion, it was depression, it was anxiety, it was this feeling of total failure and an inability to achieve anything because of, they said, the burden of urbanization, increased competitiveness in the business, and women's active participation in society. Just shook them up. And the less capable white men felt, the more anxious they became. And a lot of those anxieties, I think, this has not been published, had to do with the relative liberation or freedoms, the gained freedoms of women. Now, almost everything I'm telling you tonight comes from Gabriel Jack Chen. And if you're interested in the war against Chinese restaurants, you've got to get his paper written when he was a law professor at Duke. He's now at UC Davis. So I have to say, and so I'm citing him. These were Chinese restaurants were places of racial mixing, freer from the regulation of a traditional society at a time of cultural change when women were starting to vote and were headed towards a national suffrage. See, so Jack, I haven't talked to him about this yet, but Gabriel Jack Chen is identifying this thing about women's freedoms as contributing importantly to neurasthenia and all of this anxiety about Chinese restaurants, because clearly Chinese women, white women wanted to go to Chinese restaurants. And in the middle of all this emerged the chop suey craze. There were boycotts, there were riots. Chinese communities were driven out of cities like Portland and Tacoma. Samuel Gompers issues this screed as the president of the American Federation of Labor. And these are the chapters. Have Asiatics any morals, the opium haddocks, and so on and so on. But what's important to tell you about this is that if you read this, laced throughout these various headings is anxiety about white women. It just is a major theme. And I didn't know that. I didn't know how important it was, or how persistent it was, or how central it was. until preparing for this presentation, boycott. So there's an undertaker's, and the flies on the dead body migrate to the Scab bakery next door and get all over the baked goods. So it's pestilence. And that's a part of the talk that I can't go into, this thing about health, the clean air ordinances, and so on. That's a whole other part of the war against Chinese restaurants. Legal methods on the municipal and state levels. And in Chicago, these were some of the attempted measures against Chinese restaurants, prohibiting women from entering, curfews, taxes, limiting patronage to people with citizenship. The only one of these, again, that passes is the very last one. That one did make it through the city council, where construction and remodeling permits around Wabash and 23rd were not permitted. And the argument for it in the city council minutes is that we have to keep them from invading said neighborhood, 23rd and Wabash. Now, we're getting towards the end. In Des Moines, George Wee has a restaurant called Wee Ying Lo. He has a contemporary named Li Din. Now look at the contrast between these. This is George Wee's grand opening. 5 years later, he's facing deportation. Li Din, on the other hand, is a local hero. So what's going on? How does this happen? I'd like to explicate this a little bit, because it has a lot to do with resistance versus accommodation. I think you know where I'm going with this. So he opens up May of 1908, and the raids immediately begin, because you saw that headline, War on Chinese Restaurants. We're going to shut them down. And they're not kidding. Immediately, raid after raid after raid after raid. Now look, it has so much to do with women again. 4 women arrested, 2 girls, 4 women, 7 girls, 2 women, 3 women, 1 woman, 9 girls. They all plead not guilty. I made sure to write to tell you that according to the press, they all plead not guilty, including George Wee. He's resistant. Now this is interesting. What is a chop suey ordinance, which was unanimously passed in Des Moines? Any place where male or females of disreputable character gather, where loud talking is indulged, food and drink is served, and shall be deemed a disorderly house. In other words, a fun place. But this one fails too. This one doesn't pass the district court, because there's a sense of unconstitutionality. That's interesting. Well, anyway, Cora grew up in Des Moines. You know the Hubble family? Look, George Wee's long-term lease is canceled by the Hubble Company, and he has to shut down. Then deportation proceedings start against him. He flees to Chicago, where he's from, and that's another thing that's important, because he's from Chicago, and he's going to the hinterlands, Des Moines. And anyone from Chicago is suspect. When we moved to Des Moines from Chicago, neighbors who eventually got to know us said, well, we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if we were going to get robbed. So there's that thing going on. He flees back to Chicago. They apprehend him, drag him back to Des Moines, throw him in jail, and he's charged for keeping a disorderly house. A fun place. And then I lose track of him in 1914. Federal Immigration Inspector S.L. Whitfield is seeking to deport him, and then he drops off the map. I can't find him in Des Moines. I can't find him in Chicago. Maybe he just gets on a boat and goes back to China. This is screw this. I'm done. That's what I would have done. Now, Li Din, he starts a chop suey place, and he's immediately arrested too, just like George Wee. But look what he does. He pleads guilty. He pleads guilty. And then, things are quiet. A few years later, he's being sought out by the press for commentary on culture. He's talking about, in an amusing way, he's talking about the differences between Chinese and English language. And then he donates to the Associated Charities. And then he's a police collaborator in 1914. In his restaurant is a whistleblower, this man named H.L. McMullen. And he's charging that the city bondsman, the jailkeeper, is taking bribes for early release. And he's yelling it at the restaurant, probably drunkenly. So the police prevail upon Li Din and says, press charges against him. And he does it. So Li Din is a police collaborator. He makes a big deal out of his wealth because he knows that in this culture it's God, right? So he makes $10,000 a year, he proclaims, in 1914. That's $300,000 a year in today's money. He invests $40,000 in the silver market. He calls the local press. He makes a big deal about it. It's very effective. He urges fighting with the Japanese because they're the common enemy. They're the enemy of the U.S. and they're the enemy of China. This is very deft. He gives household tips to housewives. He does his Martha Stewart thing. He joins the Red Cross, makes big donations. And when he retires in 1924, he's a local celebrity. Now look at this is the closing sentence of the tribute to him. Things won't be the same to the old crowd that knew Des Moines as a straggling country town with growing pains, whose only touch of bohemian life was Li's place, until Li returns. Isn't that interesting, right? We start with trying to get rid of them. And now it's like this kind of cloying, saccharine, nostalgic, we hope he comes back. I mean, it's just such a shift. That's in 1924. Anyway, so as I was saying, it's a story of resistance versus accommodation. And it's kind of worth for all of us to think about it because, in our own lives, we're faced with these ethical decisions. And it's that old thing, what would you have done? I think Fong's restaurant went under because he couldn't juggle the difficulties of satisfying his white patrons and continuing to serve blacks. I think if he were alive, I would ask him, but I didn't know any of this when they were living. Now, we're at the end now. Hang on. Sorry. Lenore found this, by the way.
I had Paris figured out all different. Well, I suppose Paris means something different for everyone. For you, I imagine it means clothes. To Mr. Reynolds, an interview, pause between business deals. To your uncle, I dare say it means change.
And to you?
I don't know. There was a time when it meant everything. Gaiety, glamour, adventure. Now?
And now?
Now it's just a place to live. And eat onion soup at 1 in the morning. In America at this hour, I suppose it would mean chop suey.
Give me chop suey every time.
I don't know but I agree with you. Years ago, I used to be a reporter. After we put the paper to bed at night, we used to stop in at a little place on the corner for chop suey and,
Or young.
boy young. I haven't thought of that for years.
I suppose living in Paris makes up for not having a bowl of chopped suey.
I suppose so. It's not the chopped suey you miss. It's what it stands for. Home, America, friends. Fellows I used to know. Plain things without sauces.
Hello, Mr. Trevor.
Hello, Fred. Off your beaten path a bit tonight, aren't you?
Yes, I guess I am. You know, if these folks want to see all the sites marked on the picture postcards, I'm beginning to think they've been getting the wrong kind of postcards.
So, you know, that's William Powell and Carol Lombard, 1931. You know, just as a contrast to the iniquitous chop suey joint, and then here it is in 1931. But, you know, a lot has changed, right? I mean, I haven't even begun to kind of talk about what's happening globally, you know, Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang, how China is recognized, his government, the nationalist government, is a legitimate Chinese government by 1928. You know, lots of stuff is going on, but there it is. This is a stark contrast where it's American. And so the question becomes, did the war against Chinese restaurants fail? And, you know, you see how these municipal and state ordinances and statutes tended to be defeated. But all the while, on the federal level, the anti-Chinese legislation, 1882, 1902, 1917, 1924, they get more and more and more restrictive and stringent. My father came in 1926, and that's the strictest period of anti-Chinese legislation, 1924, the Act of 24. How many Chinese could enter? The quota was 2% of the 1890 population, which is less than 2,000 people. So from 1890 to 1920, the Chinese population in the United States is literally cut in half. The yellow peril is crushed. And it's generally perceived that these Chinamen, well, I think they're going to stay in their lanes. They're going to stay in Chinese restaurants. They're going to stay in laundries, right? So the yellow peril is over. They've been subdued. Is that a victory, right? That's the question. Did the war against Chinese restaurants fail? If it's a victory through loss. That's my premise. But we can talk about that. You know, we can talk about that more. Let me do one more thing. I just wanted to say good night using this card from Hong Fong Lo. This is a Chicago restaurant. So here they are. These are the bohemians, the fun seekers, the sinners. Here they are. So, like in the spirit of these like sinners, let's converse and let's eat. That's it then. Thank you.